For a long time, Australia's geographical position on the edge of the world seemed to be its best defense. The continent, surrounded by oceans, was too far from the world's political hotspots and wars for anyone to attempt a serious invasion. It was believed that in case of danger, allies would come to its aid, and for the time being, a small army and a limited amount of equipment would suffice. The country's economy wasn't geared towards mass arms production, and society was used to the idea that threats always remained somewhere over the seas. Military budgets were cut without hesitation, with a simple justification. Why spend millions on planes and tanks if the nearest potential enemies are thousands of kilometers away? Even the few combat vehicles that were in service were more suited for training and demonstrations than for actual combat. This continued until a new force appeared on the horizon, one that was fast, ambitious, and unpredictable. This force changed the rules of the game in Asia so quickly that in Sydney and Canberra, people began to realize that their familiar world was crumbling right before their eyes. The illusion of security, built over decades, was starting to fall apart. Australia could ignore its own weakness in peacetime, but on the verge of war, its geographical isolation ceased to be a form of protection. It was then that the realization came. The peaceful existence was over. The shadows that once seemed distant were approaching too fast, and the country, unaccustomed to serious military challenges, felt for the first time that the luxury of inaction had come to an end. When Europe was just starting to talk about World War II as a global fire, in Asia, this fire was already spreading at a terrifying speed. Japan transformed into a powerful war machine, acted boldly and swiftly. It wasn't just increasing its presence at sea, but was literally sweeping aside one nation after another. Within months, it had taken control of territories that had only recently seemed like a convenient buffer for Australia. The Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, Burma. These names appeared more and more often in reports, and each new message brought the danger closer. Japanese troops, battle-hardened and equipped with modern technology, met little serious resistance. Their fleet dominated the Pacific Ocean, and their air force acted with a confidence that said they were going to go further. For Australia, this was a genuine shock. If the oceans had previously seemed like a reliable wall, they were now turning into a road leading directly to its shores. Japanese ships and planes could cross that distance without difficulty. The threat of invasion was no longer imaginary. It was becoming a matter of time. Newspapers wrote about Japan's victories on every new front line, and for the first time, Australian society felt an anxiety that couldn't be silenced. People discussed how many days it would take for the enemy to land in Darwin or on the northern coast. Even the calmest officials admitted that if the aggressor decided to strike, there would be almost nothing to defend with. The army, which existed more on paper than in reality, seemed too weak to face the enemy, and while such conversations used to seem like empty debates among military experts, they were now becoming a part of daily life. For the first time in a long time, Australia felt it was no longer an observer, but a potential target. A shadow hung over the country that could not be ignored, and that shadow looked more and more like the wings of Japanese planes, ready to darken the sky over the continent at any moment. When it became clear that the threat of invasion was no longer a phantom, but a real possibility, the Australian Military Command decided to check what the country actually had for defense. The results of these checks were so disappointing that a funereal silence fell over the headquarters. Instead of modern fighters, the hangars held planes more suited for training flights or light reconnaissance tasks. Their speed and armament left no chance in a clash with the Japanese machines, which had already proven their superiority in battles across the Pacific. The artillery, which had been a source of pride just a few years earlier, looked outdated and cumbersome. The equipment required constant repair, and there was a clear lack of ammunition for long operations. It became obvious that the illusion of self-sufficiency that the country had been living under was shattered in an instant. Even the simplest scenarios showed that if Japan decided to attack seriously, Australia would not be able to hold them back for long. The troops had limited experience, and the air shield was practically non-existent. Commanders studying possible defense plans saw not strategic diagrams, but dead ends. Any attempt to build a line of defense came up against the same question: what to fight with? There was no answer, and the deeper they analyzed the warehouses and bases, the clearer it became. In the event of an attack, the country would have to rely more on hope and courage than on weapons. This sober and harsh reality check sobered everyone up. The illusions were over. For the first time in many decades, the Australian leadership admitted that the Army's real readiness was far from the formidable speeches heard at rallies and in newspapers. It was time to decide where to seek help and how to survive if the enemy truly appeared at the continent's shores. Australia understood that it could not stand alone, so the first steps of the military command were not directed at factories and design bureaus, but at its allies. Urgent requests were sent to London and Washington. They needed combat planes, modern fighters, and equipment supplies, or the continent would remain defenseless. The answers were polite but cold. Britain, exhausted by the war in Europe and North Africa, was barely holding its own borders and could not afford to send hundreds of machines to distant Australia. America had not yet fully entered the war and was also not in a hurry to squander resources. Moreover, the Allies' strategic priority was clear. All the equipment that could be gathered was going to the Soviet Union. The war was already raging there, with the front burning from Leningrad to the Caucasus, and every shipment had an immediate effect. In comparison, Australia looked like a potential battlefield, but not a place where the fate of the war was being decided. The Australians waited for help, but never got the planes. Not a single full squadron was sent south by the Allied powers. Politicians explained it as strategy, but to ordinary citizens and soldiers, it sounded like a refusal. The continent was left alone with the looming threat. These diplomatic failures were a heavy blow. Where there had still been a belief that the Big Brother would always provide cover, there was now the understanding that they could only count on themselves. And at that moment, Australia faced a question on which its fate depended. Could the country create its own air force, even from scratch? Or would it have to wait for Japanese planes to appear in the skies over Sydney and Melbourne? Left without support, Australia was in a position where hope could only come from within. The decision was made quickly. If the Allies couldn't share their air force, then they had to create their own. But saying, "We'll build a fighter," and actually building it were two completely different things. At that time, the Australian aircraft industry was young and limited. Factories were able to produce equipment under license, copying foreign models and adapting them to their own conditions. The country assembled British bombers and American trainers, but developing a full-fledged fighter seemed an almost impossible task. They lacked both design experience and specialists accustomed to world-class design challenges. Nevertheless, there was no choice. Under the threat, the industry was forced to restructure. Engineers who had previously worked on trainers and transport aircraft got involved. Factories began to hastily expand their lines, purchase the necessary machine tools, and set up the production of parts that had previously been imported. The most valuable resource was time, and that was exactly what they were catastrophically short of. They had to turn a paper project into a real plane in a matter of months, one that was capable of taking to the air, and at least theoretically countering Japanese machines. The government understood the risk, but had no other way out. If the country didn't create its own fighter, the defense of the continent would be impossible. It was at this moment that a story began that would later become a symbol of forced ingenuity, the story of the Australian Boomerang. A question immediately arose for the designers: where to start? At the time, only two types of combat aircraft were produced in Australia. The first was the heavy twin-engine Bristol Beaufort bomber, assembled under license. The second was the WWII light bomber, created based on an American trainer. Both options seemed far from ideal. The Beaufort was reliable but cumbersome, heavy, and clearly not suitable for conversion into a maneuverable fighter. The WWII looked much more modest, but its design offered at least some flexibility. Additionally, it was already in production, which meant there was a higher chance of getting a finished result faster. The decision was a forced one. The military understood it was a compromise, but there was no time to create something fundamentally new. Engineers decided to use the WWII as the base and use the Boer's developments as a donor for individual components and engines. This approach allowed them to combine already available resources and at least get closer to the goal of having their own fighter. Thus, the choice fell on a plane that was originally intended as a trainer. In peacetime, this decision would have seemed like madness, but in the reality of war, it became the only possible step. Australia needed a weapon right here and now, and even the most imperfect project was better than empty hangars. Work on the new fighter began in a hurry, but with a firm understanding that there was no time to wait for a miracle. The engineers took the WWII's fuselage as a base, simplifying the design process as much as possible. However, it was impossible to leave it unchanged. The trainer wouldn't have withstood the stresses of real combat. The frame was reinforced, the cockpit was redesigned, and the weapon system was integrated to meet the demands of the front. The heart of the new plane was the engine borrowed from the Beaufort. It was a licensed version of the American PR and Whitney already in production. Using this engine was a key decision. It allowed them to create a combat vehicle in record time and not depend on external supplies. Changes were made to almost everything. The wing design was reworked to increase maneuverability. The fuselage was shortened and made more compact, giving the pilot better visibility. The armament was arranged to combine cannon power and machine gun density. The resulting plane was not a copy of either the WWII or the Beaufort. It became a separate machine that couldn't be called a simple conversion. It was named the Boomerang, symbolically and with an Australian flair. A boomerang returns to the thrower's hand, and this plane was supposed to return the blow to the enemy, even if not always on equal terms. So, from a set of compromises and forced decisions, a unique Australian design was born. The machine, created out of desperation, became a symbol of how a country accustomed to peace suddenly became a forge for its own weapons. When the first boomerangs came off the assembly lines and their data was presented to the military, the numbers didn't inspire enthusiasm. The fuselage was just over 8 meters long, the wingspan was about 11, and the height was less than 4. All of this made the plane compact and easy to control, but it didn't give it a particularly formidable look. The maximum takeoff weight of around 3.5 tons seemed acceptable, but the engine's capabilities didn't allow for an impressive speed. At its peak, the Boomerang barely reached 500 km/h, a figure that was already inferior to the Japanese Zero and American Mustangs at the time. The practical range of 2,500 kilometers looked decent, but the 10,000-meter ceiling limited its capabilities when encountering higher-flying bombers. The armament seemed balanced, but not revolutionary. 2 20mm cannons and 4 7.7mm machine guns. This was enough for close combat, but more power was needed to intercept heavy targets. Later, the ability to carry smoke bombs was added, but this spoke more of a retasking than of an increase in combat potential. All these characteristics evoked mixed feelings. On the one hand, Australia finally had its own fighter, made by its own hands. On the other, it couldn't compare to the machines of the leading powers. It wasn't the proud pinnacle of engineering thought, but a solid average created under conditions where the best is the enemy of the good. Nevertheless, these average figures hid the most important thing. The Boomerang existed. It flew, it shot, and it could perform combat missions. For a country that had only recently been effectively without an air shield, this was already a great deal. The first combat missions put everything in its place without any illusions. Boomerangs took to the air to meet Japanese bombers approaching the coast. It seemed like the moment of truth. Their own fighter had to prove that the efforts were not in vain, but reality was harsh. The Japanese machines, although not the most modern, had a speed that the Boomerang simply couldn't match. The pilots pushed the levers to the limit, trying to squeeze everything they could out of the engine, but the distance didn't close. The bombers calmly dropped their payloads and headed back out over the ocean, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. For the Australian pilots, this was both humiliating and dangerous. They saw the enemy, heard their engines, and could even get close for a brief moment, but a real interception wasn't possible. In an aerial duel, it's not just courage that matters, but also speed, and that was exactly what the new machine lacked. The military reports of that time were written dryly, but desperation could be read between the lines. The Boomerang wasn't up to the task it was created for. It couldn't be a shield against raids, which meant the hope for its own interceptor was crumbling as quickly as the initial expectations were built. This bitter discovery was a turning point. Australia had its first combat plane, but it turned out to be too slow to perform its main mission. The country had to find a new use for the machine, or all the efforts would turn into a senseless adventure. And yet, the Boomerang had an unexpected trump card, a psychological one. When the Japanese bombers first encountered it, their crews didn't immediately understand what kind of machine was rapidly rising from Australian airfields. For the enemy, it was a new silhouette, an unknown model that wasn't mentioned in reconnaissance reports. This factor worked in favor of the defenders. Japanese pilots were used to there being almost no resistance over Australia, and the sudden appearance of a squadron of fighters knocked them out of their usual rhythm. Sometimes the reaction was panic. Without waiting for an attack, the crews dropped their bombs wherever they could and rushed to turn back towards the sea. Such raids rarely caused serious damage, and this was the first real victory for the Boomerangs. Even if they couldn't catch up to the enemy and force a full-fledged fight, their mere presence disrupted the enemy's plans. The Japanese didn't know how dangerous the new machine was and weren't willing to find out for themselves. For Australia, this meant an important change. Even if the technical characteristics didn't allow for equal competition, the Boomerang created an element of surprise and made the enemy nervous. Under conditions where every minute of delay and every unplanned drop could save lives, this was much more than just a consolation prize. The psychological pressure turned into a weapon, and the machine itself became a symbol that Australia would not give up and was ready to meet the raids with something rather than with an empty sky. The arrival of more modern Allied machines in Australia changed the balance of power. American Kitty Hawks and Mustangs took on the interception task, quickly proving their superiority over Japanese fighters and bombers. The Boomerang was pushed into the background, but that didn't mean its end. The military understood it was too early to write off the plane. Despite its lack of speed, it was maneuverable at low altitudes, solidly built, and its armament allowed it to effectively engage ground targets. Where accuracy was needed more than speed, the Boomerang could perform much better. Pilots began to retrain for new tasks. Their main mission now was to escort ground units, strike fortifications, and support allies on the front line. The plane that had shown weakness as an interceptor unexpectedly became useful where methodical and precise work was required. So, a new chapter of its service began. The Boomerang ceased to be a disappointment and became a tool, not a glamorous one, but reliable. War demanded flexibility from its technology, and it was this flexibility that saved the machine from oblivion, giving it a chance to prove itself on a different battlefield. When the Boomerang lost its role as an interceptor, it found a new purpose: to work where the fate of the war was decided on the ground. Its relatively low speed, which was once considered a weakness, now became an advantage. The plane could confidently stay at low altitudes and perform maneuvers that were risky for faster machines. The main tactic was this: the pilot would fly as low as possible to the front line, literally skimming over trees or jungles, and precisely drop smoke markers right next to the target. A warehouse, a fortification, or a column of vehicles. These markers became a guide for the heavy bombers that would appear higher up and deliver the main strike with a minimal chance of missing. In addition to laying smoke markers, the Boomerang could also attack targets with its cannons and machine guns. Its firepower allowed it to mow down enemy personnel, suppress strong points, and cover the advance of the infantry. Pilots noted that at low altitudes, the machine was surprisingly responsive to the controls, and its strong frame gave it a chance to return even after serious damage. This work required courage and precision from the pilots. By flying so low, they risked being hit by anti-aircraft fire and machine guns, but it was their actions that allowed the heavy machines to work with maximum effectiveness. The Boomerang became a kind of laser pointer of war. It didn't always deliver the main blow, but the success of the entire operation depended on its accuracy. Thus, a plane created out of desperation unexpectedly became an important element of tactics. It was valued not for speed or its brilliance in duels, but for its ability to work where every meter and every second mattered. Against the backdrop of brilliant Allied machines, the loud victories of the Mustangs, or the formidable raids of heavy bombers, the story of the Boomerang looked modest. But it was in this modesty that its special role lay. It wasn't fast, wasn't considered state-of-the-art, and didn't inspire fear with its appearance. However, it became the support without which entire operations could have ended in failure. On the Pacific Front, it was used where reliability and courage were needed, not records. The Boomerang helped the infantry, marked targets for strikes, and covered allies at critical moments. For the soldiers who saw it overhead, it was a symbol that help was near, that they hadn't been left alone under fire. Pilots had different feelings about it. Some complained about the speed, others about its limited capabilities in combat against the enemy, but many remembered the machine with warmth because it allowed them to survive in situations where there was no other choice. Its strong fuselage, responsive handling at low altitudes, and the ability to return even after serious damage made the Boomerang an indispensable companion in the sky. Today it remains in the shadow of the more famous planes of World War II. It's rarely mentioned in textbooks or films, but for Australia, it has become a symbol of ingenuity and perseverance. When the Allies turned away, the country found the strength to create its own shield, even if it wasn't perfect. The Boomerang went down in history not as a champion machine, but as a hero of forced decisions. Its legacy is a reminder that sometimes value is not determined by numbers on a chart, but by the fact that the technology arrived on time, when it was most needed.